almost live. There we go.
This is
So it's all
absolutely
yours.
terrifying. The miracles of technology. All right, so coming to you live from Joburg, I suppose the point of a lot of the work that my research is sort of heading towards is understanding impact and how we as local actors can make sense of a lot of these sort of global shifts that are happening. And, you know, this is happening with a lot of really interesting agreements coming through, like obviously the Paris Agreement is now in the spotlight again, but also my focus on cities is looking at the new urban agenda, you know, Sendai framework on disaster risk. And so the question is, how do we turn these, and of course, planetary boundaries, which is what Jian ensnared me with. So I suppose the question is, how do we make sense of these very large global shifts that are happening and make them relevant to our local contexts, which are firstly unique, and also not necessarily capacitated to deal with these or interpret these larger frameworks. So the new urban agenda, for example, is miraculous because it spells out what the image of a, you know, inclusive, resilient, sustainable, participatory, safe city should mean, equal city. But it doesn't give that much about how you actually get there, which obviously is hard to do from a global perspective because everyone will have different pathways. And obviously sitting in the global...
It's so unique to each different location and each different culture.
And sitting in the global south, obviously we have differing priorities. So in our current economic format, and I believe Lorenzo's joining as well, so he'll refute our current economic system. But in our current economic system, we suggest that growth is the answer. And then eventually social welfare will join that. We have the priorities living in very unequal societies of getting resource access to the larger population. But we are also living in a space where the majority, we're also living in a space where our development comes within constraints. So the world has suddenly realized that there isn't enough resources, that we have been polluting, throwing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so we have a unique position where we want to develop, but now there's limitations. And planetary boundaries, I think, is the perfect conceptual framework to display that. Firstly, because it moves the conversation away from climate change only. You know, so businesses who say we're sustainable, we're carbon neutral, well, all very well, but you're deforesting this, you're causing extinctions, for sure, you're putting out other chemicals. So it's
and one thing I just love about that, just to jump in, is it's all of a sudden a metricing system that can then go to these corporate organizations, because everyone says we are sustainable, but here's a print kind of going, I don't quite know about that. You know, there's a bigger conversation to have.
And it's not to diminish, you know, the usefulness of a lot of the sort of initiatives that have come around the sort of carbon monitoring, sort of carbon trading. It'd be interesting to see if a lot of the other biophysical components of the planetary boundaries could potentially be traded. And this is, again, diving into a kind of business as usual economic position where you say, can we value these biophysical ecosystem services, you know, and trade them in order to protect them? Or in order to give the more accurate value of business. So yeah, and recently they've also been looking at how to tie in social targets. So I think in a process along the same lines as the Sustainable Development Goals, what are our ideals for society? So I think these form very good conceptual frameworks, but the question emerging is, how do you then share responsibility? So all very well saying we've got these thresholds. So I'm sure you've seen the sort of planetary boundary framework. We've got these 9 biophysical processes, each with estimated thresholds and zones of uncertainty, you know, which once we enter, we don't know what will happen. And of course, they all interact in interesting ways. So it's a nice piece of scientific work which tangles with uncertainty. But but basically, what does that mean for, you know, my inquiries in Cape Town? What does that mean for Cape Town's decision makers? You know, I applied a methodology. So this is some work developed by Hunweg and Kennedy, where they sort of made a first attempt to sort of scale down, say, an urban approach to planetary boundaries. What does this mean? And it was very interesting, sort of applying it. And you saw they did social targets and biophysical limits. And it was interesting, of course, to see for the ones that are sort of outside of their biophysical limits, they have very good social systems. And for the people with limited impact on the environment, their social targets are sort of well off. And so these are what we expect. As you develop and have better social services, you're going to be more destructive to the environment. How do we change that?
Because ironic, because it's about the social environment, right? It's about the collective, around the ecosystem. It should be about well-being rather than this other thing. But that's
exactly
10 other conversations in there.
And when you're expecting massive development in the global urbanization rates, population growth, and an increasing an American or European, it's we will surpass all of these boundaries. It's not possible, and it is in the best interest. And this is me stealing a bit of an idea from my from the academic coordinator of the SI, the Sustainability Institute. It is in the world's interests to invest in green technologies or green systems in the global south, because otherwise we're all screwed. So coming back, I think planetary boundaries is a very good framing device. And I think the gap in research is how we make it relevant to local decision makers. So what I came across by applying their methodology, which sort of does a decent job of sort of scaling down and working out which of the biophysical risks are appropriate to cities. What I noticed is Cape Town has no impact on the world's freshwater resources. And this, for example, one of them.
Sure.
So if a local decision maker looks at this and say, that's great, we can consume as much water as we want. However, of course, at the point in Cape Town, we are in the throes of the worst drought in however long. Climate is changing. Our dam's the lowest point in, how long is it now? 9 years, something like that. Clearly, this makes no sense. Clearly, we have water restrictions and limitations. So how do we then decide what our limiting factor is? If global limits are irrelevant to Cape Town, now comes the point to have a local limiting factor. So that's where I'm at.
And that must be so exciting to really then find what's unique to the Cape Town blueprint, or the DNA of the city, in terms of what those special conditions are.
Exactly. And then in looking at the different systems, what are the appropriate moves to follow in terms of addressing them? So for water, most of the water comes from higher levels in the mountains. You can't really return treated water back into that, so we pump it into the oceans. What about reusing water? And I think there are some people who are exploring what that means. There have been some attempts to look at what the projects would be, and I think the major issues with those is matching kind of the treatment plants that could retreat water to their distribution networks, and of course a very difficult ability to store it, given Cape Town, where you'd build a dam would be in the Cape Flats, or you can't build one on Table Mountain because disaster risk issues. But so I think there's a lot of meat for local sort of innovation and local work that can shape a lot of these larger notions of boundary into, well, what does this actually mean for us?
So I guess an exciting place there as well is then what does it become the questions that go to these decision makers? Because as you said, we need to make it relevant. We need to look at the footprint and what's happening here. But then, what then emerges, and then where, and continuing the research so that there is no gap. So we don't build a dam on Table Mountain or do something that is really counterintuitive.
And it's definitely worth engaging a lot with the city practitioners. I think from an academic standpoint, we often don't realize how much capacity actually exists there, and so it's actually engaging and working on, well, what can we add to these conversations.
Mm.
You know, and the notion of cities, of course, is these sort of bounded, you know, structures. You know, the Cape Town boundary doesn't include the watershed or the larger biosphere. So,
Okay.
in a way that requires somebody to negotiate those different boundaries. Um,
Mm.
yeah, I've just pulled up the sort of images again of the planetary boundaries one. So the ones that Kennedy and Hohenweg developed were carbon
Mm.
emissions, biodiversity loss, and so biodiversity, obviously, as a treasured aspect of Cape Town, is important to look at. Um,
Yeah.
Carbon emissions, biodiversity loss, and change in land use, the ones that have sort of surpassed their thresholds. So carbon
Mm.
emissions, South Africa is heavily reliant on electricity.
Mm.
And almost all of it comes from coal. And so
Mm.
the way that the city could affect its carbon emissions would be addressing traffic, which obviously also has social implications, given that most of these are single occupancy
Mm.
vehicles, which plug up the roads and stop public transport from actually working. Um, Biodiversity isn't necessarily my sort of area of expertise, but I believe there's lots of really interesting work going on there.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and then the ones that are sort of under the limits, but sort of approaching are
Mm.
then freshwater use, nitrogen cycle,
Mm.
chemical pollution, and then they've developed a boundary called geophysical risk, which I think
Mm.
takes into account more local attributes of the city, which would
Mm.
contribute to that. Yeah.
Mm.
Anyway, yeah, I think
Mm.
that's where I'm at, and I think that's you know, from what I could see as a contribution to the urban
Mm.
conversation, is this is a framing device more than a
Yeah.
tool. This is where are we
Well,
at
I guess
and where could we
it
go?
is also a tool for, I guess, at least seeing, or at least a metricing system in terms of that kind of thing.
Mm.
Or a tool to at least kind of go, we need to be having various conversations with various stakeholders, which is by nature part of what this event is, by bringing together different movements, by bringing together different voices in this whole citizen science movement, that we need to be engaging on all levels. You know, the change
Yeah.
makers can go out and do one thing, and the government can go out and do something else, but we're not all collectively looking at the same problem.
Mm. No, exactly. A while back, coming across the term of a boundary object. So if we can create some very interesting visualizations, you know, and strong sort of data supported arguments, then those can be objects around which you bring different stakeholders together. So I think, yes, planetary boundaries is very good, fair enough, as a tool for that type of conversation. Yeah.
One kind of curiosity that's coming up, because I'm sure there might be people even connecting outside of Cape Town to our chat over the weekend, is then how do we take, because obviously this whole concept is a universal concept, but then how do cities apply this kind of technology? Because it's I'm almost wanting to say it's hard to scale it because it's so unique. There's a consensus, but it's so unique to each city.
Mm.
So how does each city then reproduce something? Like, what was been your challenge in making this uniquely Cape Town?
So I think I would want to defer this question to probably Dan Hohenberg,
Okay.
who I think Jen has made contact with, because I
Yes.
think he and Chris
Okay.
Kennedy have been working out how to do rather rapid assessments of a wide number of cities.
Sure.
The contribution that I think I would work on is you know, again, in scaling from a global to a local, from a global goal to a local action, is a bit more of working out, I suppose, what are the limiting factors. So at some stage, a global average, you know, so for example, carbon emissions, you know, that's has global implications, whereas land use change, biodiversity, and water tend to be within or near or around city boundaries. So I think part of the tool or framework that would be developed would be how to decide which limit to use. Do you use a global one or do you use a local one? And capacitate your local city practitioners to understand what are the global, what are the local contextual limitations.
Sure.
You know, and that will then go hand in hand with what we are actually able to affect based on the different types of policies or technologies that we have at our disposal in each of these spaces. You know? So I think Cape Town, the water crisis has shown us a lot about what should be desirable in terms of government management. We've got a phenomenal climate change adaptation framework, but given how the reduction in rains and I suppose minimal planning for population and affluence growth struck the city, clearly it didn't work. And we've had this massive storm, which I was a bit sad to miss, actually, as a huge example of how the climate is changing. The worst storm in 30 years. And this is actually along the lines of what the framework predicted. It says an increase in intense rain events. A decrease in overall rainfall, but an increase in these events. And we have phenomenal capacity, in terms of our knowledge systems, but it's not trickling through into action. And the city acted incredibly sternly, but perhaps not as effectively or quickly enough in terms of how it got consumers to reduce their water consumption. And the minute the rains arrive, psychologically,
which is still very much in play. I mean, there's still
and
these continuing reductions.
Of course, and we finally passed, I think, the 700 million liters per day mark about 4 months after restrictions began. So, this is not a blame game. This is how do we actively learn from these types of things to make sure that these events are less frequent, and how do we continue these lessons? This season will be fine, I believe, but psychologically, when it rains, people will think, that's fine. Now there's water. Now the dams will fill up. Hopefully it's fine. And, the BBC posted a comment saying Cape Storm hits as drought ends. And it's like, the drought is not over. I'm not worried about this season. It's, are we able to think about next year when it rains now? Because now we've got abundant rain, maybe that will come. Hopefully that will come. But will it fill our dams? Has this, have these restrictions changed how we think about water? I hope so. But
I saw something, and this is on social media, so I don't know who the source is and where they pulled this information from, but something like it'll take 3 years of really intense rains, or at least decent rains, to really bring the dams back to capacity, and that's scary. If we're not thinking future.
We need to actually apply long-term systems thinking. We need to think about feedbacks. Restrictions, in my opinion, should stay fully in place, no matter how we perceive our water to be. This is the first of what could become a repeated crisis, a repeated annual crisis. And I'm confident that the city is thinking about this. This is not, as I say, a blame game. You should have done this, you should have done that. Of course, it's easy in South Africa for everything to become politicized. DA gets blamed by ANC and all of this. Let's not forget that Gauteng had a water crisis at the beginning of the year, and now the Vaal is overflowing. So, local context. I think that's our theme: global goals and local context.
Absolutely. One question is popping up, and I'm a little bit hesitant to share it because I think it might just show my naivety. So I'm kind of like running it through my mind in terms of leaping it.
Yeah.
But as these movements start happening, as citizen science, as the stakeholders really come on board and really start making the efficient, effective shifts, how soon can we start seeing in terms of those parameters change? Can we be using that to track us moving into a good thing, or are we still going to pretty much be in the red zone for? I mean, I know it's bad, so I'm not.
The scientists who presented planetary boundaries, as they brought them out, said these are going to be constantly shifting boundaries. We've presented a first estimate. That was in 2009, Strom et al. And then in 2015, Stefan et al. Brought out an updated version, which also took into account scaled differences. So looking at some regional land use and water patterns. So but their founding premise is that these are what we think are our boundaries based on the best science that we have available now, and surely they will shift, because we're living in multiple hierarchical systems which are all based on different relationships and all interact, and there's feedback that we understand and there's feedback that we don't understand. Obviously politically this is annoying because politicians want to be able to say this is our boundary and as long as we're there we're fine. I don't believe in such a thing as a sustainable city as an entity. I think we like the idea, but it's about a continuum. So you can always become more or less sustainable, but will you ever achieve absolute sustainability? Probably not. Everything's changing too much, and there will be something new which emerges. So, we had a wonderful success in addressing one of the boundaries which exists, which is ozone. It was a massive global campaign, and CFCs or CFC producing bodies were thoroughly dismantled and removed worldwide, and that was a phenomenal, resounding success. So, whether we can worry about carbon emissions, an expert in metals, Thomas Gradell, sort of scoffs when people bring up climate change. He says, it's just one element. I work in metals. I work in hundreds of different elements that we have to look at and see that they're either scarce or so I think we have the capacity to avoid these thresholds, but inevitably another one will emerge. So I think there are wonderful technologies for addressing water scarcity, both social and technical technologies. So behavior shifts along with perhaps desalination or better treatment systems for reuse. In Singapore, they reuse a lot of their wastewater to great effect. And so I think we really need to reshape our understanding of waste, both solid waste and industrial waste and human waste. And and it's understanding what is normal. And, I really enjoy what we can learn from science fiction. We have, let's say, Dune, in which people in the desert wear suits which recycle their bodily fluids. Perfectly normal. We as outsiders to that system think, but actually, once
science fiction has helped support a lot of the science, because it's kind of been a playground of science, kind of going, can we create that? Is it a possibility? And let's look at that. So it's an interesting correlation.
Exercising the imaginaries, no idea is too out there. It simply has to become normalized.
Of course. So I guess one other big question that I just want to get really clear on, in terms of how can this conference serve you? How can the various stakeholders and the work that is being done in terms of planetary boundaries and what's happening in Cape Town, where can we support this and give voice to it and hack what we're doing in the room to really make this meaningful?
From my perspective, there have been really great shifts, but cities are still very data scarce environments. Most of our knowledge about cities, data information about cities comes from estimation. And especially in spaces where informality is the predominant mode of being, not tracked, not billed, not regulated, not taxed, whatever the definition of informality is that you wish to look at. It makes for a fascinating and really interesting space. But with cities, I think in order to make a shift to more sustainable, more inclusive, more resilient, whatever the buzzword is that you're attempting, knowledge is power. And so I suppose in terms of a hackathon, finding ways to access data, produce data, collect data, as well as present it in engaging ways. I think is the key. You know,
And
and
to
a
get
lot of
that
the work.
data talking to other data as well, because it's so easy to just do data in isolation, I'm sure.
Absolutely, and communicating it and comparing it. So, you know, a lot of the work that I'm about to embark on as well is comparing methodologies, comparing methods, because for the most part we use proxies or estimates, and so it's working out which are the best. You know, we work in modeling quite a lot, and the underlying premise is that all models are bad, all models are wrong, excuse me, and some are useful. And so if you're trying to work out how to turn the complexity of the world into something that you can find intervention points in, you have to acknowledge that you won't understand the big picture. But science is there to try and get us closer and closer to that. Yeah. So information knowledge is power is the main point, especially in these days. So
like a true researcher.
yes, give me data.
Give me data.
No, but it's you know, if the end goal is to support data-driven decision making, not simply this sounds right, but to actually empower the decision makers and politicians with data which will allow them to be better at who they are. If their job is to support the will of their constituents, we must understand that. We can't get outraged when politicians do what is entirely predictable. We have to understand the political system and work out how we can address it. Or so you know, for Cape Town at least, there are statements, you know, for desiring better inclusivity, and I think there have been phenomenal attempts to get basic services delivered, but many of the times those sort of projects have failed, and through no, this is getting too political perhaps, but not necessarily through fault, but lacking data or lacking strong theory to support a lot of the decisions, you know, means that, and beyond that, also lacking participation, you know, and oftentimes we think we know what people want, because it is what we think we would want, and all you have to do is ask, you know, and people will be very forthcoming. You know, there was a person at one of the Habitat conferences who said, we worked in the Department of Housing, and we go into a place and we say, we have housing, and people are like, no, we want electricity, water, sanitation, you know, don't need anything else. And it's like, we have housing. So actually, you know, allowing, empowering government with information, with some more systems thinking and systemic thinking, I think will go a long way.
Critical, because the emotional argument hasn't been winning. I mean, it has made some sort of an impact, but the data and the wisdom that comes from that data feels like really the key.
And it's very sad in this world that the dignity argument isn't good enough. You know, once people have an experience, if they walk into an informal settlement or into a poorer space, and they have an experience which tends to frame their actions, and from then on they may be more aware of it, but it's absurd that the dignity argument doesn't work, and so you have to make an economic incentive for people to feed children and provide basic services. Are you kidding? And so this might go back to what I'm saying, which is you have to understand the political realities. And so you know, in Ghana there was load shedding. I was there for a while, and in South Africa we were complaining about 2 hours of load shedding every day. In Ghana the power was off for 24 hours and on for 12. And it became quite obvious that the politicians had no sense of what was going on, because when Parliament had 10 minutes without power, suddenly all the MPs said, this is not how we should be living. This is not the Ghana we expect. Completely oblivious to the fact that their citizens are going without power for very long periods. You know, so yeah, finding ways to you know, meet the decision makers where they're at is important. And again, this isn't to disparage decision makers. I think you're balancing lots of different priorities, often which we as outsider academics or citizens or businesses, don't actually get insight into. So, it's difficult. And I think the main point is information and communication.
Definitely. And the other buzzword that I'm hearing in what you're saying and what a lot of the other speakers want to bring to the space is also that context conversation, because there's just such a big correlation there. And that is interesting.
And being proud of the context, in cities which have been able to develop with vast hinterlands of wealth and resources, they've built the most glorious cities and monuments, and we need pride in our cities and in our context, in our uniqueness, not simply to copy what seems to work elsewhere, but to add some personal flair, and I believe this is also very much a long-term thinking. We look at building housing, affordable housing, and the main thought is, well, four walls and a roof.
Sure.
Actually, can we build something which is 4 walls, a roof, and aesthetically gorgeous with greenery, and something that people feel proud to live in and believe is an investment? Because this is you can't solve poverty by giving someone just an asset. You have to give. You have to be able to. They have to be able to leverage that for, if we're in our same economic system, for upwards mobility. They have to be able to drive value from it. Context, being context. I think that's a good buzzword.
That is a good buzzword. Well, it definitely gives us a lot of context to go into the weekend with. A lot of conversations that we can really hack and fine tune, and then also bring that engagement of the room into the space and have those conversations happening with you along with all the other speakers as well.
Fantastic.
So I'm really excited about that.
This has been interesting. So I hope to see what comes out of this. Yeah.
Brilliant. I'm just going to stop this recording.